said, we're going to move over into adults now, and particularly focusing on people who work shifts, owners of the lands and waters where I'm presenting from. And I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge them as the traditional owners and stewardship of this country. And I would like to acknowledge any Indigenous peoples listening today. So by way of starting, in terms of what is shift work? Well, shift work is characterized by people that work outside the normal daytime hours of 9 a.m. to 5 a.m. So it doesn't include academics who might work very long hours. It typically includes people who also work at night and past the midnight mark. The challenge that shift workers have is that their shift schedules alter their circadian rhythms and can also lead to changes and challenges in behaviors like physical activity and eating. And as a result, their glucose and lipid metabolism is influenced, as well as inflammation. And so shift workers are known as an at-risk group because they are a much higher risk for developing atherosclerosis, dyslipidemia, and insulin resistance than people who only work during the day. So just by way of background and emphasizing this is that we conducted a meta-analysis a few years ago, and we collated all the evidence looking at the risk of shift work with heart disease and cardiovascular disease, morbidity and mortality. And we found that shift work was associated with a 26% increase in the risk of coronary heart disease and a 20% increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. And what was more important for us was that there seemed to be a dose response. So the longer that people work shift, the higher these risks became. We saw that for the first 5 years, there didn't seem to be a risk of shift work and these cardiovascular disease outcomes. But after the first 5 years, there was a 7% increase in coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease, morbidity and mortality for every 5 additional years of shift work. Now, as Tony mentioned in his first talk, we look at the whole day in terms of physical activity and sleeping and sedentary behavior. So we wanted to explore the patterns of physical activity and sedentary behavior specifically in nurses, and we compared them, the nurses who work night shift with nurses who work day shift. And the other thing we wanted to explore was to see if there was a relationship between their physical activity and their self-reported health outcomes. I'm from South Africa originally, and this study was conducted with nurses living in South Africa. And at the end of this, I'll explain why that's really important in terms of context. So just in terms of the methodology of our study, we recruited 84 day shift nurses. So wherever you see the sun later on, it refers to day shift nurses, and 82 night shift nurses. They wore the actigraph accelerometer for 7 to 10 days, and they also completed a health risk assessment. The reason that it was 7 to 10 days was we wanted to ensure that we included a full cycle of shift work. In South Africa, these nurses were either permanently night shift or permanently day shift. We downloaded the data, and then we ended up with 66 day shift and 56 night shift nurses who met our criteria of wearing the accelerometer for at least 600 minutes per day. This gives you an overview of our participant characteristics. So they were approximately 40 years old, just over the age of 40. They've been working shifts for 12 and 14 years. But what's important to note is that the hours worked per day was significantly higher in the night shift nurses, and they also spent significantly less time sleeping than the day shift nurses. And this was part of a much bigger study, and we did have some qualitative data as well. And where we found that the night shift nurses would typically come home, they'd stay awake, they'd get their chores done, then they make sure they're awake when their children came home from school. So that might account for their short sleep duration. When we looked at self-reported diagnosed health outcomes, over here on the y-axis we have percentage, and in grey we see that just over 60% of the nurses reported at least one chronic disease and poor health diagnosis. And when we compared the day shift over here in yellow to the night shift in blue, we found that significantly more night shift nurses had at least one self-reported health outcome. And this was largely driven by significantly more night shift nurses reporting that their doctor diagnosed them with hypertension. We also looked at musculoskeletal injuries between the two groups, but they were similar for the night and day shift nurses. When we asked them, what does your usual workday look like? Is it mostly sitting, mostly standing still, going for short walks, or moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity? What we found was that more than half of the nurses across the board reported that their day comprised mostly of short walks. So we do see that slightly more night shift nurses reported that the day is mostly short walks compared to the day shift. But that difference was not significant. What was significant was that we had 17% of the day shift nurses saying, their day is mostly sitting, compared to only 3% in the night shift. And we also found that significantly more night shift nurses reported that their work was moderate to vigorously physically active, whereas only 4% of the day shift workers reported this. So this is interesting because when we look at what we measured using the accelerometer, we do see some differences. So what this table shows is the amount of minutes per day on average spent in sedentary time, light, moderate, vigorous, and moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. And our results show that the night shift nurses were sedentary for more than 600 minutes, nearly 700 minutes a day, and they were also significantly more sedentary than the day shift nurses. This is in minutes per day. They will also spend more time in both light and moderate intensity physical activity than the day shift nurses. Now, when we looked at the amount of time that they spent in each of these activities as a proportion of the day, so looking at it as a percentage of 24 hours, this is what we found. So we have percentage over here, and in pink, we see the amount of time or the proportion of time spent in sedentary behavior. And we've also quantified this for work days and non-work days. So when we looked at the work days, we see and compared it to non-work days for the day shift nurses, we see that more than half of their time was spent in sedentary behavior, and there wasn't really a difference between work days and non-work days. We also see that the next largest proportion of time was spent in light intensity physical activity. It was slightly less on a non-work day than the work day, the day shift nurses, but again, no significant differences. This was a different story when we looked at the nurses who worked night shift. When they worked night shift, they spent about 65% of their time in sedentary behavior, and this was significantly less when they were on a non-work day. So I hope you can see the decrease in the amount of time that they spent sedentary on a non-work day. They also spent more time in light intensity physical activity on a non-work day than a work day, and they also spend more time in moderate intensity physical activity on a non-work day. So overall, the night shift nurses spent a significantly greater proportion of their time in light and moderate intensity physical activity on a non-work day, and they were less sedentary on a non-work day. We then looked at the diagnosis categories. So we grouped them into nurses with 0, 1 or more than one self-reported chronic diseases and looked at the differences using a logistic regression in terms of the percentage of time that there was sedentary, light intensity or moderate intensity physical activity. And we didn't see any difference or significant differences. So for the day shift nurses, for example, we can see that for sedentary behavior, there is a slight increase in the proportion of time they spend sitting per day, where those with no diagnosis were spent about 60% of their time sedentary, whereas those with more than one diagnosis spent about 62% of their time sedentary. So when we looked at this really homogeneous group where they were all nurses, we found that the night shift nurses spent more time sedentary and in light intensity physical activity on a work day compared to those who work day shift. And we think that it's probably due to their longer shift duration and their shorter sleep time when we're looking at this in absolute minutes, because they have more minutes of awake time where their accelerometer is recording data. When we looked at this as a proportion, we saw that the night shift nurses were less active during work hours and more active during non-work hours on a work day than day shift nurses. I didn't show that too much just because of the time limit, but there was also a difference between work days and non-work days for the night shift workers. And unfortunately, we didn't see any associations between the proportion of time spent moving or sitting and self-reported diagnosis of disease. We also explored, before I get there, just in context, South Africa is part of the global South. We're a low middle income country. And one of the things we were wondering is this amount of physical activity accumulated? Because in many occasions, the nurses may not have had an option of whether they wanted to be physically active or not. So, for example, most of the nurses reported that they used active transport, so they used either walking or using public transport to get to and from work. And we think that the contribution of the transport is a large contributing factor to the overall level of physical activity, and it might not be related to what they're doing at work or in their leisure time. So I included this because I think it's something we need to consider when we are looking at physical activity patterns, particularly in people from the global South, where we need to be aware that some activity might be because they just have to do it, they don't have a choice. And if they had a choice, they might have been traveling to work by car. This led us to compare differences in time use across different sectors. So this was a smaller study, and it was smaller mostly because we really struggled to recruit participants. But we'll be looking at the variations in sleep, sedentary behavior, and moving in shift workers and on a work day. And we looked at the work day when they were working day shift, a work day when they were working night shift, and a non-work day. And importantly, it was from 2 different sectors. We used 3 main measures to collect data. The first one was a self-report measure called the marker, where participants reported on everything they did in 5-minute increments from the time they woke up. And we also used the Gini active because we wanted data on sleep and the active pulse. And I'm going to just briefly present you some data from the marker. Our participants in workplace 1, these participants worked at one of the local airports where I live. And their job required them to drive around the runway and ensure that the runway was safe. So they were largely in the vehicle driving. The people in workplace 2, or the participants in workplace 2, was from a manufacturing company, and they spent most of their time standing up because they were on the production line. There were no real differences in terms of age or the amount of men participating in our study. However, we did find that the participants in the manufacturing plant had a significantly higher blood pressure reading than those in the vehicle-based occupation. I'm going to walk you through this relatively slowly. So this is workplace one, a reminder that these are people that spend most of their work hours in the vehicle. And we looked at the amount of time spent in these various behaviors on a day shift, a night shift, and their days off. And in blue, we see that there's a slight increase in the proportion of time that they spend sleeping on their days off. So they spend more time sleeping on their days off than on a night shift or a day shift. We also see that there isn't very much change between the proportion of time that these workers spend in sedentary behavior. However, when we look at sedentary behavior of workplace one in orange, sedentary behavior in workplace one, and we compare to workplace two, we found that workplace one was significantly more sedentary than those in workplace two, especially on a work day. And it's expected given that they're in the car versus workplace two being on a production line. We also found that those in workplace one spend significantly more time in light intensity physical activity. And the amount of time they spent in light intensity physical activity was similar when they worked, and it decreased slightly on their day off. These workers on their day off spend significantly more time in moderate and vigorous intensity physical activity on their days off than on their work days. Now, when we look at workplace two, keeping in mind that they are manufacturing employees, we found that they spend quite a large proportion of their time in moderate intensity physical activity when they worked a day shift and when they worked a night shift. And that was significantly more than those from workplace one. We also see that they spend significantly less time in moderate intensity physical activity on their days off. On the other hand, they spend significantly more time in sedentary behavior on their days off. So there is a compensation or compensatory behavior taking place. So just in summary for that particular study, when we compared moving and sitting, it was more marked or more significant or more important, if you like, when comparing the two workplaces against each other than when we compared the workers from each workplace on a day shift, night shift, and a day off. In workplace one, our driving people, they were more sedentary and did less light intensity physical activity on a work day, but they reported participating in more moderate to vigorous activity on a non-work day. And the opposite was true for workplace two. They were more active on work days, and they reported less moderate to vigorous intensity activity on their non-work days. So when we are looking at shift workers and trying to categorize or trying to quantify the amount of time that shift workers spend sleeping, sitting, and moving, one of the things we really need to keep in mind is that those behaviors are influenced by the type of occupation and tasks. So not all shift work is equal, so we need to be cautious when we group all shift workers into the same group and try to find an answer for all of them. We really need to take into account the industry they're in and their job requirements and tasks. We found that the nurses who work night shift were less active during their shifts than after the shift. And both the studies we did, and I didn't have time to go into it in more detail, does show that there's a compensatory behavior when comparing work and non-work time. So if your work time entails more sitting and less moving, those people tend to sit less and move more when they're not working. And the opposite is true for people whose work includes more moving and less sitting. So on their days off, they're going, oh, I need to take a break and rest a bit and not be as active. And we found a similar compensatory behavior when we looked at working hours versus non-working hours on a work day. So I I hope that it hasn't been too confusing and too much because we're comparing work hours and non-work hours and work days and non-work days. But I do hope that the main message you see is that when we're quantifying physical activity, sleep, and moving for shift workers, we really need to consider the type of occupation. So thank you very much for your time, and welcome any questions that you might have.